With the August 1st U.S. tariff deadline behind us, what are all the tariffs affecting Canadian businesses now? With the long list of U.S. tariffs, exemptions, delays, and increases announced since January, and the counter tariffs and exemptions announced by Canada, it's easy to be confused about what Canadian and U.S. products are actually subject to tariffs and at what rates. Let's start with the U.S. tariffs on Canadian products, including the effect of CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, the free trade agreement negotiated during Donald Trump's first term as president. First, U.S. tariffs on Canadian CUSMA-compliant and non-CUSMA-compliant products. 50% tariffs apply to steel products and derivatives and aluminum products from the original 2018 and aluminum tariff list. This is a change as of June 3rd from the 25% tariff that applied only to non-CUSMA compliant steel and aluminum products. 50% tariffs apply to semi-finished copper products, for example, copper pipes, wires, rods, sheets, and tubes, and intensive copper derivative products, for example, pipe fittings, cables, connectors, and electrical components. They do not include copper input materials, for example, copper ores, concentrates, mats, cathodes, and anodes. Next, U.S. tariffs on Canadian CUSMA compliant products. 25% tariffs apply to the non-U.S. content in Canadian CUSMA compliant automobiles. Aside from this tariff and those on steel, aluminum, and copper products, no other CUSMA compliant products are subject to U.S. tariffs. Note that the Bank of Canada estimates 95% of Canadian products are now CUSMA compliant. And finally, U.S. tariffs on Canadian non-CUSMA compliant products. 35% tariffs apply to all Canadian non-CUSMA compliant products, other than energy products, potash, and steel, aluminum, and copper products. 35% tariffs apply to Canadian non-CUSMA compliant automobiles and non-CUSMA compliant automobile parts. 10% tariffs apply to non-CUSMA compliant energy products and resources, which include crude oil, natural gas, lease condensates, natural gas liquids, refined petroleum products, uranium, coal, biofuel, geothermal heat, the kinetic movement of flowing water, and critical minerals. The Bank of Canada estimates 100% of Canadian energy exports are CUSMA compliant. 10% tariffs apply to potash that is non-CUSMA compliant. RBC estimates the bulk of Canadian potash exports are CUSMA compliant. A new 40% tariff applies to non-CUSMA compliant goods transshipped via another country to evade the 35% Canadian tariff. The U.S. de minimis treatment for low-value shipments will be eliminated as of August 29th. Goods valued at $800 or less will now be subject to all applicable duties. Now, what Canadian products are non-CUSMA compliant and therefore subject to the U.S.'s tariffs on non-CUSMA compliant products? It's difficult, if not impossible, to come up with a definitive list. An internet search or AI query will come up dry. Whether there's a specific product is CUSMA compliant depends on whether it meets the CUSMA rules of origin. As such, the same type of product made by different manufacturers may each have different CUSMA compliant statuses depending on where they source their parts and materials. Therefore, we were not able to find a list of non-CUSMA compliant products, or conversely, a list of CUSMA compliant products. However, recall that the Bank of Canada estimates 95% of Canadian products are CUSMA compliant. How about Canadian counter tariffs on U.S. products? What specific U.S. products are subject to these tariffs? Canada's counter tariffs have so far not changed since March, other than being delayed for some sectors starting in April. Canada imposed 3 sets of counter tariffs. On March 4th, 25% counter tariffs were imposed on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods imported annually. On March 13th, 25% counter tariffs were imposed on a list of steel products worth $12.6 billion and aluminum products worth $3 billion, as well as additional imported U.S. goods worth $14.2 billion for a total of $29.8 billion. On April 9th, 25% counter tariffs were imposed on non-CUSMA compliant U.S. made vehicles and on the non-Canadian and non-Mexican content of CUSMA-compliant U.S.-made vehicles. Again, there are no definitive lists of vehicles that are CUSMA-compliant or non-CUSMA-compliant. On April 15th, the Canadian government announced a 6-month exemption to October 15th of tariffs on goods imported from the U.S. that are used in Canadian manufacturing, processing, and food and beverage packaging, and for those used to support public health, healthcare, public safety, and national security objectives. On April 15th as well, the Canadian government also announced remission is available in respect of the tariffs on Phase 1 goods, the steel and aluminum retaliatory tariffs, and the auto retaliatory tariffs. In terms of specific U.S. products targeted by the March 4th and 13th tariffs, the Government of Canada website has a web page listing each set of products. However, these two web pages are hundreds of pages long and include painstakingly detailed definitions and descriptions of all the different variations of each product. So we've summarized them here for easy reference. The following categories of U.S. products are subject to Canada's 25% counter tariffs imposed on March 4th. Food products, for example, fruits, vegetables, grains, oils, sweeteners, dairy, and meat. Textiles and apparel, for example, clothing, carpets, linen. Personal care and cosmetics. Household goods, for example, furniture, appliances, cleaning supplies. Industrial materials, for example, wood, plastics, and rubber. Machinery and tools. And another category, for example, tobacco, firearms, and art. The following categories of U.S. products are subject to Canada's 25% counter tariffs imposed on March 13th. Household goods, for example, candles, tableware, household items. Metal products, for example, gold, iron, and steel ingots, as well as aluminum wire. Tools, for example, hand tools, saw blades. Fixtures and fittings, for example, locks and pipe fittings. Electronics, for example, printers and copiers and computers. Furniture and decor, for example, furniture and lighting. Recreation and leisure, for example, toys and sports equipment. Cleaning supplies, for example, brooms and brushes. Personal care, for example, combs and slides. For our 15-page summary of the specific products subject to Canada's March 4th and 13th counter tariffs, see the link below this video or in our LinkedIn post. As we can see, Canada's counter tariffs on U.S. products are broad. As such, many companies who resell products from the U.S. will see their costs increase as long as these Canadian counter tariffs are in place and unless they find substitutes in Canada or elsewhere at similar prices. Companies who buy parts or materials from the U.S. to manufacture or process their products or package food or beverages will see their costs increase as of October 15th. For other ways to navigate this trade war with confidence, get the free Complete Trade War Success Guide for small to mid-sized companies below. If you're a prairie CEO who wants to grow a thriving company more quickly, more easily, and with less stress and headaches, please contact me via email, via the Connect page on my website, or DM me on LinkedIn. I hope you found this useful.